With Boston freed from British occupation, the Americans began to consolidate their control over the city, and the Continental Army redeployed to meet threats elsewhere. Given the shifting strategic situation, what happened to the cannon that Henry Knox moved from Ticonderoga to Boston in early 1776? With the Army's pending departure, Massachusetts's congressional delegation urged the colony's government to keep the cannon brought from Ticonderoga in Boston. They argued the city needed to be fortified to resist any future attacks and provide a safe harbor for the Continental Navy, privateers, and merchant vessels that would sustain the American war effort. Congress allowed Massachusetts to retain any cannon it had contributed to the Continental Army. It gifted them guns left by the British, and finally agreed that any iron guns from Ticonderoga not needed by the Continentals could remain. Washington, however, urged Massachusetts officials not to rely on the Ticonderoga guns, as they would likely be used by his forces. Cannon were already needed in other quarters, particularly in Canada. What guns the Continentals did possess there were too few and too small to make an impact on Quebec's walls. But General Philip Schuyler told Washington he had little artillery to send north. Washington apologized that Knox should have removed guns needed in Canada, intending only for him to have taken what could be spared, but Knox's expedition began before General Richard Montgomery's failed attack on Quebec, and cannon and mortars took on a greater significance during the ensuing siege. Even if cannon could be supplied, the Canadian Army lacked sufficient gunners and artillery officers with experience to man them. Accordingly, on March 28, 1776, Henry Knox issued orders to Captain Ebenezer Stevens to take his and Captain Stephen Badlam's company of the artillery regiment and reinforce the army in Canada. Before receiving this assignment, and before joining Knox's regiment, Stevens had served in Boston's pre-war artillery company, he had participated in the Boston Tea Party, and served in a Rhode Island artillery unit during the siege of Boston. And all this before the age of 25. Stevens's detachment took some of the guns that Knox had brought from Ticonderoga that winter, including two massive 13-inch iron mortars, following General Schuyler's pleas for heavy artillery in Canada. Stevens prepared to make the reverse of Knox's trip, and beyond, all the way to Quebec. And this in the spring, a far more challenging season in which to move. Setting off from Cambridge, Stevens found the journey extremely challenging. Carts broke down as he reached the hills of New Hampshire. Feed for the oxen was scarce even before reaching the Connecticut River and the road to Lake Champlain. Local inhabitants helped the column on its journey, and Stevens had orders to seize oxen as needed to make up for losses. Meanwhile, Knox prepared the rest of his artillery regiment to depart the American lines outside Boston, bound for New York. Knox added to his stores what shot and shells the British abandoned. On April 3rd, he received orders from Washington to begin his march. 300 teams of oxen were mobilized to begin the journey. Soldiers loaded wagons and carts with the Army's ammunition, powder, and other supplies. Anticipating the needs of the Army, Washington ordered Knox to get the most needed stores out first, including pre-made artillery rounds loaded in tumbrils, as well as materials to make musket and additional cannon cartridges. Not anticipating another siege, shells and other heavy equipment were scheduled to move off last. With Knox went the Army's artillery, including guns he had taken from Ticonderoga, especially the best bronze field pieces and mortars. Knox's artillerymen would march through Rhode Island to Norwich, Connecticut. Near there, they embarked in boats on Long Island Sound to continue the journey to New York, where Washington's army was preparing to concentrate. Meanwhile, Captain Stevens's detached companies crossed the crude road over the Green Mountains with their heavy artillery, stores, and soldiers. They followed the Otter Creek across Vermont and arrived at Lake Champlain north of the Continental posts at Ticonderoga and Crown Point. Arriving at the lake, they loaded onto boats as reinforcements streamed toward Canada, including additional cannon Schuyler had ordered north from Crown Point to join the siege of Quebec. After traveling over 160 miles by water and 40 days after leaving Cambridge, Stevens's artillerymen reached Trois-Rivières, Quebec along the St. Lawrence River on May 12th. Despite the hardships, in many ways even greater than what Knox had encountered that winter, Stevens's detachment suffered only a single casualty, who fell sick at the Connecticut River, but recovered and made his way north. Stevens safely brought all his artillery and stores to Canada. But by the time he arrived, the situation had changed dramatically. Just 1 week before his arrival, the Continentals had abandoned their siege of Quebec. Stevens, his guns, and his artillerymen were caught in the American retreat, which would not end until reaching Ticonderoga again in early July. Beyond the 2 heavy mortars that Ebenezer Stevens took to Canada, the nature of the record-keeping at the time rarely allows for us to follow specific guns across the broader campaign of 1776. In general, though, they shared a fate as diverse as the Continental Army, whether shoring up the defenses of Boston or being sent to reinforce New York or Canada. Over those months of movement and later combat, the specific origins of these guns were lost. But what is clear is that Knox's Ticonderoga cannon gradually merged into the Continental arsenal as the United Colonies marched toward becoming United States.